So I want you to imagine that you're playing a game, right?
Mm.
And you're sitting at a table with two buttons in front of you.
Okay, 2 buttons. I'm with you.
Right. And button A, if you press it, it gives you a really, really high chance of having a stable, secure life. But there's a catch.
There's always a catch.
Yeah. The catch is it completely caps how rich you can get. Like, you are never going to be a billionaire. It's mathematically impossible.
Right. A solid floor, but a low ceiling.
Exactly. But then you have button B, and button B gives you this tiny, almost microscopic chance of becoming insanely wealthy. But, and this is a big but, it comes with a massive chance of economic insecurity. Like paycheck to paycheck, one medical bill away from ruin and insecurity.
That is a terrible gamble.
It is. But here is the wild part. Right now, today, millions of Americans, specifically median income Americans, are practically mashing button B.
Yeah, they really are.
They are actively supporting economic policies that, you just look at the math, heavily favor the ultra-wealthy. And for decades, commentators and political scientists have looked at this and just thrown their hands up, basically saying, you know, these people are voting against their own interests.
Which is such a condescending way to look at it.
It really is. They assume that these voters are just, I don't know, bad at math or hypnotized by cable news. But what if that assumption is just completely backwards? What if they're not bad at math at all, but they're optimizing for a totally different definition of human dignity?
That's the real question. It's the defining economic debate of, well, the last half century. And to actually understand it, we have to look way past the spreadsheets. We have to look at the psychology.
Right. So today, that is our mission. We're doing a massive deep dive into the psychology, the historical mechanics, and the actual reality of Reaganomics and modern fiscal conservatism. We're unpacking a huge stack of sources today to figure out why we vote the way we do.
And we really need to get into the structural shift, how we went from an economy that rewarded making physical things to one that basically just rewards managing money.
Exactly. But before we get into the weeds here, I do need to make a really explicit disclaimer for you, the listener.
This is important.
It is. The sources we're decoding today, the historical data, the research that contains highly charged political themes, we are going to be talking about left-wing progressive fiscal policies, and we're going to be talking about right-wing conservative fiscal policies.
And we are not picking a favorite.
No, absolutely not. We are not taking any sides here. We don't endorse the viewpoints of either political party, and we aren't validating any specific platform. Our one and only job today is to impartially report, decode, and analyze the ideas and the hard data from the original source material.
We're just following the causality wherever it goes.
Right. We're just the messengers. So to follow that causality, we need to set the stage. What is our vantage point right now?
Well, today is March 19, 2026. And we are looking at this incredibly complex, highly financialized American economy. But if we want to figure out where this whole thing is heading by the year 2050, we can't start here. We have to time travel.
We got to go back.
We do. We have to go back a full 50 years to understand the absolute crucible that forged the modern conservative economic mindset. We have to go back to the 1970s.
Oh, the 70s. The sources make this incredibly compelling argument that you literally cannot understand the appeal of Ronald Reagan without first feeling the visceral, bone-deep exhaustion of the 1970s.
Yeah, it wasn't just disco and bell-bottoms.
No. I mean, we always hear it summarized as this decade of bad hair, but economically and psychologically, it was a decade of just identity-breaking drift. It was the slow erosion of the whole post-World War II American dream.
Which is a huge contrast to what came before. I mean, the 50s and 60s, for all their flaws, were defined by this widely shared economic growth, and there was this profound trust in American institutions.
Right. People believed in the system.
They did. But by the early 70s, that foundation is just cracking everywhere. You have the hangover of the Vietnam War, which completely fractured the moral consensus of the country.
Yeah.
You've got the Kent State shootings, where the government literally turned violent against its own youth. And even the good stuff, like the Apollo 11 moon landing in '69, that optimism just faded instantly because the domestic crises were piling up.
Think about the psychological fallout of that. If you were a working-class citizen back then, you were raised in this diet of American exceptionalism, right? Like, we won the World War. We built the middle class. We went to the moon.
We were the good guys.
Right. And suddenly you look around in the early 70s and you're asking, why is the social fabric tearing apart? And then in the mid-70s, any institutional trust that was left just completely shatters with Watergate.
Yeah, 1974. Nixon's resignation.
It wasn't just a political scandal. The sources point out that it was a permanent inflection point. It changed how Americans viewed federal power forever. The cynicism just became systemic.
And it's right when that political cynicism takes root that the economic pain gets really acute.
Right, the oil shocks.
Exactly. 1973, we get the first massive oil shock. The oil embargo happens, and the price of oil practically quadruples overnight. And this introduces the public to a word, an economic anomaly that economists back then thought was basically impossible.
Stagflation.
Stagflation, it's the boogeyman that still keeps central bankers awake at night.
Let's break down the mechanics of stagflation, because I think it's crucial. Prior to the 70s, the economic theory was all based on the Phillips curve.
Right, the inverse relationship.
Yeah, this idea that inflation and unemployment sit on a seesaw. If the economy is hot and unemployment is low, inflation goes up because people have cash to spend. But if unemployment is high, nobody's buying anything, so prices should drop.
They're not supposed to go up at the same time.
Exactly. But the 1973 oil shock totally broke that seesaw.
Because oil is the baseline for everything. It's a fundamental input for almost all industrial activity, all transportation. So when the price quadruples, the cost to make and move literally anything skyrockets.
Right, so factories can't afford to stay open.
Exactly. They run at half capacity, they lay people off, unemployment spikes. But because the baseline cost of energy is so high, the price of everyday goods just keeps soaring anyway.
So you have a stagnant economy plus rampant inflation.
Stagflation. And it is an absolute nightmare for the median wage earner.
It really is. Like, imagine your paycheck is buying less and less at the grocery store every single week. But at the same time, the factory down the street is boarding up its windows and you're terrified you're going to lose your job.
It's just complete paralysis. You have middle-class families watching their savings evaporate. Entire regions of the country are starting to rust.
And by the late 70s, this dread just reaches a boiling point.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter is president, and in 1979, he gives this televised address. It becomes known as the malaise speech, even though, fun fact, he never actually used the word malaise in the speech.
Right, he called it a crisis of confidence.
Yeah, he basically diagnoses the nation as having this loss of spiritual and moral direction. Which honestly, if you read the transcript today, it's a shockingly accurate sociological read of the country.
He wasn't wrong.
No, he was telling the truth about the exhaustion. But politically, it was a disastrous misread of the room. I mean, if you're standing in line for 3 hours just to put gas in your car and your savings are getting eaten alive by double-digit inflation.
You do not want the president acting as your therapist.
Exactly. You don't want to be told you have a spiritual deficit. You want a tangible solution.
People wanted competence. They wanted strength. And instead, they just got hit with a cascade of humiliations. Late 1979, the Iran hostage crisis starts. American diplomats are held captive for 444 days.
And it was on the news every single night.
Every night, a running tally. Day 100, day 200. It projected this image of American impotence across the whole world. And at the same time, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, which cranks the Cold War anxiety right back up.
It's just blow after blow. And behind all this geopolitical humiliation, the inflation crisis is peaking. So Carter appoints Paul Volcker as the chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Oh, the Volcker shock.
Yeah, Volcker decides that the only way to kill this inflation monster is to just choke off the money supply completely.
Yeah.
So he raises the federal funds rate to levels that are, frankly, just unfathomable today.
We're talking mortgage rates hitting 15, 18, even 20%.
20% on a house.
Just try to imagine the paralysis that causes. If you're a young family in 1980 trying to buy your first starter home, a 20% interest rate makes it mathematically impossible.
Volcker basically had to induce a brutal intentional recession just to break the back of inflation. It was the bitter medicine.
And it caused immense short-term suffering.
So the country is choking on this bitter medicine. They feel completely defeated. It's like being on a cross-country road trip with a slow-leaking tire. Every time you try to patch it, another blowout happens. So you just want to abandon the car on the side of the highway.
That's a great analogy.
And the sources bring up this brilliant cultural touchstone that perfectly captures how desperate the country was for a win. February 1980, the Winter Olympics.
The miracle on ice?
Yes. The U.S. men's hockey team, which is just a bunch of amateur college kids, defeats the Soviet Union team, which was this heavily favored, state-sponsored juggernaut.
It's hard to overstate how big of a deal that was. That hockey game is the perfect proxy for the national psyche. It wasn't just a sports upset.
No, it was a pressure release valve.
Exactly. For a country that had endured a decade of assassinations, scandals, lost wars, gas lines, for one night, millions of Americans looked at their TVs and felt the sudden surge of pride.
It sparked this dormant desire to believe that, hey, maybe we aren't in terminal decline.
Which is the perfect setup for what happens next. The 1970s had completely exhausted the public's tolerance for shared sacrifice. They didn't want to hear about limits to growth anymore.
And out of that sheer exhaustion steps a former Hollywood actor offering a total psychological reset, Ronald Reagan.
Reagan was offering a masterclass in political psychology. He didn't just offer new policies. He offered an entirely new narrative architecture for the country.
The shift in tone is wild. Jimmy Carter looked at the country and saw people who needed to accept new limitations. Reagan looked at the country and said, no, we're just being held back by a bloated, pessimistic government.
His famous quote, right? Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
He practically weaponized optimism.
Yeah.
Morning in America. It wasn't just a campaign slogan. It was an emotional rescue mission.
It was. He shifted the American identity from being a victim of circumstance to being an agent of destiny.
Okay, but let's move from the psychology to the actual mechanics of his playbook.
Yeah.
Because Reaganomics fundamentally re-engineered the American tax code and the regulatory state.
It really did.
Let's start with the most famous pillar, supply-side economics and the massive tax cuts.
Right. When Reagan took office, the top marginal income tax rate was 70%. 70. And by the time he left office, after the Tax Reform Act of '86, that top rate had been slashed all the way down to 28%.
That is a structural earthquake in how wealth is retained in this country.
Yeah.
From 70 to 28. Let's unpack the justification for that, because it's based heavily on this concept called the Laffer curve.
Named after the economist Arthur Laffer.
Right. And the legend goes that Laffer literally drew this curve on a cloth napkin at a restaurant in 1974 for Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld.
It's a great piece of political lore, but the underlying math of the Laffer curve is actually quite sound.
How does it work?
So the logic is simple. If the government taxes income at 0%, it collects zero revenue, obviously.
Right.
But if it taxes income at 100%, it also collects zero revenue because nobody's going to bother working if the government confiscates every single penny they earn.
Makes sense.
Therefore, there has to be some optimal point on that curve somewhere between 0 and 100 that maximizes the government's tax revenue without destroying the incentive for people to work and invest.
And the supply side argument in 1980 was that a 70% top rate was way, way past that optimal apex.
Exactly. They argued that by taxing the wealthiest Americans at 70%, the government was actively suppressing economic growth. It was deterring investment and just encouraging massive tax evasion.
So the promise of Reaganomics was, hey, if you drastically cut those top rates, wealthy individuals and corporations will take all that newly freed up capital, all those millions they aren't sending to the IRS, and they'll invest it back into the economy.
You'll build new factories, fund research, hire more people.
Right. And that increased economic activity would theoretically generate so much new wealth that the government would actually collect more total tax revenue at the 28% rate than it did at the 70% rate.
That was the pitch, that the wealth would, as the critics later called it, trickle down to the working class through job creation and higher wages.
But taxes were only half of the equation, right?
Yeah.
The second massive pillar was deregulation, and specifically a fundamentally adversarial stance toward organized labor.
Yes. Reagan aggressively rolled back rules in banking, telecommunications, energy. But if we want to point to the defining symbolic moment, the moment that signaled a permanent shift in the balance of power between capital and labor, we have to look at August 1981.
The PTCO strike.
The PTCO strike, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization.
Which is fascinating because didn't they actually endorse Reagan?
They did. They endorsed him during the 1980 election because he promised to listen to their grievances. They were dealing with outdated equipment, incredibly stressful working conditions, long hours.
But then contract negotiations break down in the summer of '81, and nearly 13,000 air traffic controllers walk off the job, which, importantly, was technically illegal because they were federal employees.
Right. Federal law banned strikes by government employees, but the union's expectation was that they were just too essential to the economy to be fired. I mean, commercial aviation would grind to an absolute halt.
They thought they had all the leverage in the world.
They did. But Reagan goes out to the Rose Garden and issues this ultimatum: return to work within 48 hours, or you are fired.
And they called his bluff.
And he fired over 11,000 of them, just like that, banned them from federal service for life. He brought in military controllers to keep the planes flying while they trained replacements. It was a breathtaking display of executive power.
But the downstream effects of that moment, that's what really matters for our deep dive today. Firing the Patsio workers wasn't really just about air traffic control.
No, it sent a massive, undeniable signal to the entire corporate world.
It basically told private equity firms and CEOs, hey, it is now socially, politically, and legally acceptable to permanently replace striking workers.
Exactly. Before 1981, breaking a strike by mass firing people was considered taboo. It carried severe PR consequences. Reagan completely normalized it.
And in the decade that followed, we see corporations adopt these incredibly aggressive anti-union tactics. Union density, which had always been the main force ensuring that wages kept up with productivity, just falls off a cliff.
The leverage fundamentally shifted from the workers to the employers.
Now, I had to point out a huge contradiction here.
Yeah.
The whole hallmark of fiscal conservatism is supposed to be balanced budgets, right? Fiscal responsibility. But Reagan was combining these huge tax cuts with an absolute explosion in defense spending.
The Cold War buildup.
Right. He was trying to financially exhaust the Soviet Union, but you cannot simultaneously slash your revenue and massively increase your military spending without blowing a hole in your balance sheet.
Which is exactly what happened. The federal deficit exploded, the national debt nearly tripled during his presidency. Total government spending didn't actually shrink, it just moved from domestic social programs over to the Pentagon.
It created this structural tension that we still see today, where the rhetorical demand for a balanced budget completely clashes with the political demand for endless tax cuts.
But despite the deficits, the cultural tone of the country completely flipped. The introspective, low-energy 70s were dead. Enter the 1980s.
The loud, aggressive, confident 80s.
You have the rise of the yuppie, the young urban professional. MTV launches, mall culture explodes, credit cards are everywhere, and you have movies like Wall Street defining this new ethos that greed is good.
The lived experience of the economy genuinely felt dramatically better for millions of people. Inflation plummeted. The stock market, which had been flat for a decade, just took off on a historic bull run.
New industries flourished. Personal computing, telecommunications, it felt like an economic miracle.
But, and this is where I really want to push back on the popular narrative, how much of that 1980s boom was actually Reagan's tax policy, and how much of it was just sheer, unadulterated demographic luck?
What do you mean by demographic luck?
Well, look at what's happening in the background. First, the Volcker shock from 1980 finally works. Inflation breaks. That was the Fed's doing, not Arthur Laffer's napkin. Second, you have the baby boomers. Tens of millions of people, the most educated generation in history at that point, are all hitting their prime working, earning, and spending years right in the 80s. Plus, millions of women are entering the workforce, massively expanding household incomes.
The labor pool just exploded.
Right. And third, you have the dawn of the personal computer revolution driving massive new efficiencies. So my question is, was Reagan a genius? Or was he just the lucky politician surfing a massive wave that was already cresting?
It is entirely fair to say the 80s boom was heavily amplified by those tailwinds. You cannot discount the economic sheer force of the boomers hitting their 30s. But dismissing Reagan's impact as just luck ignores how policy interacts with potential.
How so?
Well, Volcker's bitter pill worked, yes. But Carter didn't have the political capital to sustain it. Reagan provided the political cover for Volcker to finish the job. Furthermore, those massive tax cuts on capital undeniably poured lighter fluid on the emerging tech and finance sectors.
So the wave was coming, but Reagan's policies decided where the water went.
Exactly. His policies dictated how and where that new wealth would accumulate.
Which brings us to arguably the most critical part of this whole analysis, the mechanics of the wealth gap. Because that lighter fluid created a massive economic fire. But the warmth from that fire was incredibly unevenly distributed.
Let's look at who actually won and who stagnated.
The clear winners were finance professionals, corporate executives, and business owners. Their after-tax income exploded because of the slashed top marginal rates. But the biggest winners by far were asset holders.
The people who owned capital.
Let's use an analogy here to make this tangible, because capital versus labor can sound really academic. Imagine the American economy as an apple orchard.
Okay, an orchard, I like it.
For decades, the primary way to make a living was to be an apple picker. You provided labor. Your wages were based on how many apples you could physically pick in a single day.
Right, tied to your physical output.
Now, Reaganomics comes along, and it introduces a revolutionary new super fertilizer for the orchard. It's this mix of deregulation, tax cuts, and new financial instruments.
And the yield explodes.
Exactly. GDP goes through the roof. There are more apples than ever before. But here is the catch. If you are still just an apple picker, your daily limit is still capped by your physical labor. You only have two hands.
You might get a small raise, but your income growth is fundamentally linear.
Right. However, if you own the orchard, if you are an asset holder holding stocks, real estate, or business equity, the value of your asset compounds exponentially. You aren't getting paid for your physical labor. You're getting paid because the capital you own is multiplying in value.
That is a phenomenal way to illustrate financialization. And in the 1980s, corporate governance fundamentally shifted toward shareholder primacy.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, prior to this era, corporate profits were often heavily reinvested back into the workforce through higher wages, robust pensions, or R&D. But in 1982, the SEC changed the rules. Specifically, Rule 10b-18.
Rule 10b-18.
Yes, it made stock buybacks legally protected and widespread. So corporations started taking their massive profits and using them to buy their own stock, which artificially inflates the share price.
Which is incredible if you're a shareholder or a CEO paid in stock auctions. You are riding the fast escalator to the top. But what about the apple pickers? What about the strugglers?
The strugglers were largely the industrial and manufacturing workers in the Rust Belt. They were facing this devastating confluence of events.
Right, globalization and automation.
They were suddenly competing against cheaper labor in Japan and emerging markets. Factories needed fewer human hands. And as we saw with Pat Teo, their union bargaining power was crippled. They had no leverage to demand a slice of those new corporate profits.
And we also have to acknowledge that for lower wage workers and minority communities, the starting lines were unequal to begin with.
Absolutely.
The compounding gains of the 80s required initial access to capital or homeownership or elite professional networks. If you were historically locked out of those avenues, the rising tide did not lift your boat. It just made the yachts increasingly out of reach.
The data on this is indisputable. From the 1940s through the 1970s, worker productivity and worker compensation grew together in tandem. Two lines on a graph moving up together.
Right.
But starting in the early 1980s, those two lines completely decouple. Productivity continues to climb steadily as technology improves, but hourly compensation for the typical worker flattens out almost entirely.
So the workers are producing more, but they aren't getting paid more. Where did the extra money go?
The extra value was redirected to capital owners and the top 1% of earners.
So this establishes the great paradox of modern American politics.
This is the core of it.
If Reaganomics mathematically favored the wealthy, if it initiated the decoupling of wages from productivity, and if it structurally created long-term inequality, why do so many working-class, median-income, and lower-income Americans today so fiercely champion fiscal conservatism?
Right.
I mean, if you look purely at the spreadsheets, it seems deeply irrational. They are actively voting to remove the ceiling on wealth while weakening the floor underneath their own feet.
And this is where we have to dismantle what the sources refer to as the pawn myth.
The pawn myth.
Yes, coastal elites and progressive analysts often make this fatal error. They assume that lower-income conservative voters are simply deluded or uneducated or brainwashed by corporate media into acting as pawns for the billionaire class.
That is exactly the narrative you hear. They're just voting against their own interests.
But that narrative assumes that every human being votes purely as a rational economic actor trying to maximize their immediate financial return. People do not behave like that.
Right, we're emotional creatures.
These voters are not bad at math. They are optimizing for a completely different definition of well-being. They're voting for identity, autonomy, and values over spreadsheets. And the most profound concept here is the distinction between procedural fairness and redistributive fairness.
Let's dive deep into that because I think it unlocks the entire psychology of the modern fiscal conservative.
Yeah.
What is the difference between procedural and redistributive fairness?
Think of the economy as a foot race.
Okay.
Redistributive fairness is the progressive ideal. It acknowledges that the starting line of the race is inherently unequal. Some people are born with advanced running spikes and a tailwind wealth, generational education connections.
Right.
Others are born running barefoot into a headwind poverty, systemic bias, underfunded schools. Redistributive fairness argues that because those starting conditions are unjust, the government has a moral obligation to put its thumb on the scale.
To even things out.
Yes, it taxes the fast runners and uses that money to give shoes to the barefoot runners, aiming to level out the final outcomes of the race.
Which sounds incredibly noble and logical to someone with a progressive worldview.
It does. But procedural fairness, which is deeply embedded in the conservative working class identity, views that interference as inherently corrupt.
Interesting.
Procedural fairness argues that true justice means the rules of the race are exactly the same for every single runner, regardless of their starting conditions. The government's only job is to fire the starting pistol and make sure nobody trips anyone else.
So even if the outcomes are wildly unequal.
Even if the outcomes are staggeringly unequal, the system is deemed fair because the process was untouched. For millions of Americans, the government actively intervening to redistribute wealth feels like a violation of autonomy. It feels like cheating, even if they themselves would be the ones getting the free shoes.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
They prefer a harsh, unequal reality over a manipulated reality.
Exactly.
And this ties directly into the cognitive bias of what is visible versus what is invisible in our daily lives.
Precisely. The burdens of government intervention are highly visible, while the benefits are largely invisible.
Right, like taxes.
When taxes are taken out of a wage earner's paycheck, they see that exact dollar amount vanish every 2 weeks. They feel the loss. They know exactly what they could have bought with that money: a car repair, groceries, a family vacation. It's a tangible subtraction from their autonomy.
But the safety net is invisible. You don't wake up on a Tuesday and celebrate the fact that the bridge you drove over didn't collapse because of federal infrastructure inspections.
Nope.
You don't celebrate that your drinking water doesn't contain cholera. You don't celebrate that your aging parents aren't living in destitute poverty because of Social Security. Because the benefit is simply the absence of catastrophe, the government gets no emotional credit for it.
And when you combine the visible pain of taxation with the invisible nature of the benefits, government expansion just feels like a parasitic drain on hard work. Which brings us to perhaps the most potent psychological driver of all: the small business aspiration.
The future builder mentality.
Exactly. Millions of median wage earners do not view themselves as permanent members of the working class. They view themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires.
Right, that famous quote.
They think, I might be punching a clock today, but I am saving up to buy a food truck or start a landscaping company or launch an online business. And when I do build my empire, I do not want a punitive tax code waiting to punish my success.
But let's be brutal about the math here. Isn't this just the psychology of playing the lottery? It feels like they are pressing button B. They're accepting a massive risk of ruin for a 1 in a million chance at becoming a tycoon. Are they just ignoring the probabilistic reality that their safety net is far more likely to save them than their startup is to make them rich?
It is easy to dismiss it as a bad gamble, but doing so ignores the psychological utility of hope. It is fundamentally about dignity. If you are a median earner working a grueling job, accepting the progressive narrative that massive, invisible structural forces of capital are holding you down and you need government assistance to survive, that can feel incredibly defeating. It feels like accepting you are a victim.
Oh, I see.
Believing in the conservative mythos that hard work guarantees success and that the only thing in your way is government red tape that preserves your dignity, it preserves your drive. Rejecting the safety net is basically a daily declaration of independence.
Wow. Okay, so let's take all of that deep, complex psychology, all of that 1980s history, and crash it right into the present day. Let's do a 2026 reality check.
Let's do it.
To understand the actual stakes of these fiscal ideologies, we need to look at the exact profile of the typical listener's peers today. Who exactly is the median American right now, and what are they dealing with?
Based on the latest census and labor data we have for 2024 through early 2026, the median age in the United States has reached a record high of 39.1 years old.
39.1.
And the median household income is hovering right around $83,730.
$83,730 as an entire household.
Yeah.
And it's so important that we use the median, not the average, right?
Always the median.
Because if you put 9 regular people and Jeff Bezos in a room, the average net worth in that room is $20 billion, which tells you absolutely nothing about the reality of the 9 people. The median is the person standing exactly in the middle of the line.
Correct. And this median person, this 39-year-old, is risk-averse by necessity. They are overwhelmingly wage dependent. They do not have massive portfolios of dividend-paying stocks or rental properties generating passive income.
Their survival dictates that they trade their time for a paycheck.
Exactly. They are juggling housing costs that have massively outpaced inflation, childcare expenses, and they're trying to save a fraction of their income for a retirement that feels increasingly precarious. They value predictability above all else.
So if that 39-year-old making $84,000 is our baseline, let's scrutinize that small business aspiration we just talked about.
Yeah.
This romantic idea that we need sweeping corporate tax cuts and federal deregulation so this median earner can launch a thriving startup. Statistically, how grounded in reality is that aspiration?
As a primary macroeconomic strategy for the median citizen, it's highly flawed. The data paints a sobering picture of American entrepreneurship.
Give me the numbers.
Over 80% of small businesses in the United States have absolutely zero employees.
Zero.
Zero. They are solo operations. Freelance graphic designers, independent contractors, Uber drivers, people running side hustles out of their garages. Furthermore, the survival rates are brutal. Of the businesses born in 2013, only about 35% were still surviving 10 years later.
So the vast majority of small businesses are essentially just one person trying to supplement their wage income, and nearly 2/3 of them die within a decade.
Right. And what that means mathematically is that the massive legislative victories of fiscal conservatism, like sweeping corporate tax cuts or deregulating complex financial derivatives, rarely, if ever, apply to the actual reality of the median American side business.
Because they aren't corporations.
Exactly. A reduction in the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% is a windfall for Apple and ExxonMobil. It means absolutely nothing to a solo contractor whose business structure is essentially a pass-through entity. They don't generate enough net profit to even benefit from corporate tax shielding.
That is a stark reality check. Let's transition to the regulatory side of the ledger, because the deep-seated skepticism of government regulation is a huge driver of conservative voting behavior. Let's look at the actual scorecard of government regulations over the past 40 years. Where do the fiscal conservatives get it absolutely right, and where does their hatred of regulation actually endanger the median worker?
The conservative skepticism is absolutely justified when we look at regulatory capture and local overreach. The prime example is occupational licensing.
Oh, this is wild.
In the 1950s, only about 5% of American workers required a license to do their job, mostly doctors, lawyers, and engineers, which makes sense.
You want your doctor to have a license.
Right. But today, it is over 20%. You have states requiring hundreds of hours of expensive schooling and thousands of dollars in fees just to get a license to braid hair or arrange flowers or be an interior designer.
That is absurd. That isn't about public safety. That is about gatekeeping.
Exactly. It is established businesses using the government to pull up the ladder behind them and choke off competition. It actively hurts the median wage earner who's just trying to start a business.
Right.
Another massive failure of regulation is strict local zoning laws and NIMBism. Not in my backyard.
Yeah, local housing boards.
Overzealous local regulations have artificially choked the housing supply in high-opportunity metropolitan areas. It makes it mathematically impossible for working-class people to build wealth through affordable homeownership. In these instances, regulation really is a weapon used against the working class.
Okay, but that is the local micro-level regulation. What happens when we zoom out to the macro-level federal regulations? Stuff surrounding public health, environmental safety, and labor standards.
The narrative completely flips. When we look at the data on federal macro regulation, it overwhelmingly shows massive net benefits for the average citizen. The return on investment is staggering.
The sources have some incredible numbers on this. Let's look at the EPA and the Clean Air Act.
A comprehensive peer-reviewed analysis found that by the year 2020, the economic benefits of the Clean Air Act amendments approached an astonishing $2 trillion annually.
$2 trillion.
Yes, and that means quantifying fewer premature deaths, fewer pediatric asthma hospital visits, less lost work time due to illness. The compliance cost for industries like to install scrubbers and reduce emissions was only about $65 billion.
$65 billion cost for a $2 trillion benefit.
It is one of the greatest public policy successes in human history.
And look at labor regulations through OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. In 1970, right before OSHA was established, there were roughly 38 workplace deaths every single day in America.
30 a day.
Workers were routinely dying in factory collapses, trench cave-ins, industrial accidents. By 2023, despite the workforce having doubled in size, that number had dropped to 15 deaths a day.
Which is still tragic, but a massive improvement.
Or look at federal safety standards for automobiles. Seatbelt laws and airbag regulations are saving roughly 15,000 lives every single year.
But we are back to the tragic asymmetry of human psychology. You do not notice the absence of a disaster.
No.
The industrial worker doesn't come home on Friday night, crack open a beer, and say, "Thank God OSHA mandated structural integrity checks on the scaffolding today, otherwise I would have fallen to my death."
Right. It is the ultimate tragedy of governance. We celebrate the short-term sugar highs. If a politician gives someone a $500 tax cut, they celebrate. They see it in their bank account. They go buy a new TV. It is a tangible reward. But disaster prevention like banking regulations that prevent the next 2008 financial collapse or environmental standards that prevent a river from catching on fire, it is completely taken for granted because the reward is simply that nothing bad happened today. The reward is invisible.
And that profound psychological asymmetry makes deregulatory and low-tax politics emotionally resonant and powerful. It is incredibly easy to campaign against the bureaucrats in Washington when the costs of those bureaucrats are highly visible on a tax return, but the benefits are quietly saving your life in the background.
Which perfectly sets up our final analysis. We have mapped the historical crucible of the 1970s. We've dissected the mechanics and the compounding inequality of the 1980s. We've unpacked the deeply emotional paradox of how people vote today. We know who the median American is right now in 2026.
We have the whole picture.
So let's project forward. We have a fork in the road. What happens over the next 25 years, taking us to the year 2050, if the United States commits entirely to the conservative fiscal path versus the progressive fiscal path?
Obviously, any 25-year macroeconomic projection is subject to massive global shocks, pandemics, wars, technological breakthroughs. But if we isolate the underlying fiscal ideologies, we get two drastically different architectures for American society. Let's look at scenario A, the conservative path.
This is the model heavily influenced by the lineage of Reagan, Bush, and Trump.
Correct.
What are the structural features of that 2050 reality?
It features persistently lower taxes, particularly on capital gains, corporate profits, and high-income earners. It features aggressively lighter regulations across the environmental, financial, and labor sectors, heavily prioritizing corporate agility.
Right. Fewer rules for businesses.
It likely includes a much smaller, stricter, and more difficult-to-access social safety net. And notably, in the modern populist variant of conservatism, it relies heavily on tariffs for trade policy.
We have to pause on tariffs because the political rhetoric around them is often wildly misleading. Politicians sell tariffs as a tax on foreign countries.
They do, but that's not how they work.
Not at all. When you look at the actual data, for instance, the New York Fed's research on the tariffs implemented in recent years, they found that nearly 90% of the burden of those tariffs fell directly on U.S. consumers and domestic firms.
It is effectively a hidden national sales tax.
Exactly. It raises the price of everything from washing machines to construction materials.
It artificially raises prices for the median earner. So what does the reality of this conservative 2050 look like? It creates what we can term a winner's economy.
A winner's economy.
Yes, there is massive uncapped upside. If you are a founder, an investor, or living in an elite metropolitan hub, the sky is the limit. The friction of doing business is low, and if you succeed, you keep the lion's share of your wealth.
But the downside is terrifying.
Yes, it creates severe fragility for the wage earner. You see high private luxury operating alongside high public squalor. The public infrastructure, roads, schools, public transit might crumble under starved budgets, while private wealth skyrockets into gated communities and private services.
It's a society with a soaring, magnificent ceiling, but a profoundly weak floor.
Exactly. If you suffer a catastrophic medical emergency, or if your industry is automated out of existence, you are largely on your own.
Okay, let's pivot and look at scenario B, the progressive path. This follows the ideological trajectory of Obama, Biden, and left-leaning economists. What are the features of this 2050?
The structural features here include higher top-end taxes, specifically targeting wealth accumulation and corporate stock buybacks. It relies on intentional wealth redistribution to fund much stronger safety nets.
Like universal health care access, subsidized childcare, robust pensions.
Right, and it enforces strict regulations on labor conditions, union protections, and environmental sustainability.
A prime example of this mechanism from our sources is the 2021 expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit.
Exactly. That was a pure redistributive intervention. The government simply mailed checks to working-class families, and the data showed it temporarily lifted over 2 million children out of poverty almost instantly.
That is a massive structural intervention.
Right.
But it's not a utopia. It comes with costs and trade-offs, right?
Absolutely. The progressive 2050 reality is what we can call a cushioned society. You have a much stronger, more resilient floor, but a noticeably lower ceiling,
Growth at the very top might be slower.
or more constrained due to heavy taxation and capital flight. You risk higher bureaucratic inefficiencies, sluggish corporate innovation due to red tape, and the heavy friction costs associated with regulatory compliance.
But it changes the calculus of disaster.
It does. It is vastly more stable for the median family. It provides resilience against the economic, medical, and technological shocks that are inevitable over a human lifespan.
So we have to deliver a final verdict for you, the listener. If I am that 39.1-year-old median American sitting in my car in 2026, making my $83,000, and I have to choose a path for the next 25 years, which path actually serves me better?
If we synthesize the historical data, the Congressional Budget Office projections, and the realities of modern financialization, the conclusion is clear. For a median, risk-averse, wage-dependent American, the progressive path statistically aligns much better with lifetime stability.
Because it protects the floor.
Exactly. The progressive path optimizes for not falling. The conservative path optimizes for how high you can climb. If you are already at the top of the economic ladder, or if you possess an extreme tolerance for risk and high access to capital, the conservative path holds massive appeal.
Right.
But for the median reality, where one medical emergency can bankrupt a family, the cushioned society offers the mathematically safer bet.
This has been an incredibly deep and complex journey. Let's pull all these historical and psychological threads together for a final synthesis. What we've learned today is that Reaganomics was never just a spreadsheet of tax policies.
No, it was a vital emotional rescue mission.
It was an emotional rescue mission for an America that felt broken, exhausted, and humiliated by the end of the 1970s. It worked for that specific cultural moment. It broke the back of inflation, it restored a sense of national destiny, and it amplified the greatest technological boom in history.
But in doing so, it fundamentally altered the DNA of the American economy. It shifted the structure from a system that rewarded the labor of making things to a system that disproportionately rewards the capital of managing money.
And that structural shift left us with the complex, heavily stratified, and unequal landscape we were trying to navigate today. It perfectly explains why the gains of the 1980s compounded exponentially for the owners of the orchard, while the wages for the apple pickers flattened out into a moving walkway.
Exactly.
But more importantly, this deep dive reminds us that our political choices are almost never calculated on a sterile calculator. We do not vote solely on our financial interests. We vote based on how we want to view ourselves.
We vote for identity.
We vote based on our dignity, our aspirations, and our deeply held beliefs about whether a fair society means equal rules at the starting line or equal outcomes at the finish line.
We ultimately vote for the story we want to be true about our country and the story we want to believe about our own potential.
Which leaves me with one final, deeply provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. We've talked so much about the psychology of hard work. But if the core psychological appeal of the conservative fiscal myth is the dignity of believing that hard work guarantees wealth, what happens to the American identity in the coming decades when artificial intelligence and advanced robotics completely detach human labor from economic productivity?
That is the ultimate question.
If we reach a point in 2050 where physical and cognitive hard work is no longer the primary engine of wealth generation, will we finally be forced to change how we view the safety net? If the orchard picks its own apples, will we finally stop staring at the billionaire button B and realize we desperately need to secure the floor?